So we've got a great selection of speakers in front of us, all with lots of experience in different aspects of placemaking from different angles. So hopefully we'll get some interesting comments from you all today. So if I can just start by asking you to introduce yourselves and a little bit about your business and what your experiences in placemaking are to start with. Go for you first.
Me first. Hi, I'm Anthony. I'm one of the kind of founding members of Assemble, who are a kind of collective on the kind of fringe between architecture and art, but particularly with a focus on community spaces and spaces that look at how the people who are in a place can take greater agency of how the spaces they inhabit are created. And sorry, specifically why I'm here, I guess we've got a long kind of ongoing collaboration with the Granby 4 Street CLT, Community Land Trust, which is not very far from here, that's kind of looked at a kind of incremental restoration of that area, working very closely with the local community there. That's still ongoing. We've just started construction of the latest project, which is a kind of cafe with a flat above, quite a small scale one, but hopefully is kind of the next phase of work there.
Joe?
Hi, so I'm from Placed, and Placed is an organisation which is very much focused on diversifying those involved in the built environment. So there's two sort of broad strands. One's around engagement, so working in anything from a spatial development strategy level down to a specific square where we help local people shape the decisions, and particularly the less heard voices. And then the other side is more around young people, education and youth voice, so helping diversify who works in the sector and enabling young people to shape decisions as well. Often they're obviously excluded from the conversation, so trying to make sure their voices are heard too. Oh, and so we're Northwest.
Thank you. Phil?
Hi, I'm Phil Dawson. Got a creative placemaking consultancy called This Must Be the Place. We help developers, landlords, councils, and bids plan, shape, enliven, and manage their spaces. Culture is a big part of what we do. Meanwhile, as well, we always start immediately and test and prove concepts and ideas and partnerships through the short-term period, and then help the landlords to convert those into permanent leases where possible. We've done a lot of work in culture catalysts, worked on Depot and Escape to Freight Island in Manchester, Printworks and Drum Sheds, using culture to establish a regeneration project, change the identity of an area, and work with local groups, community groups, to get involved in those kind of projects and use the funds that we get through corporate hires to support and fund community projects.
Thanks, Phil. And Kirsten?
Hiya, I'm one of the co-founders of Make CIC. We've been running our organisation for 12 years. We've got 3 spaces across the city region, and we help people turn their passion into prosperity. We do that through workspace, mentoring. We've got a programme of events and education, and we build big, amazing public projects. You may have seen some of our work last year in the Liverpool Loves Taylor when Taylor Swift came to town, and we'll use the hyper-local workforce that we've got, so the skills of our tenants, our makers and our artists, to deliver those projects from concept through to design to delivery of those projects.
Brilliant, thank you. And I realise I've spoken a few times today, but I actually haven't introduced myself yet. So my name's Lynn, Haime, the Chief Exec of Baltic Creative. So we're obviously heavily involved in this part of the city, our own creative placemaking in terms of the business spaces that we have in the Baltic Triangle. So I don't know if you want to have a quick look over your shoulder to see where we've ended up with. No huge surprises, I don't think, but interesting people and community obviously at the heart of it all as far as the audience perception, culture, connection, green spaces. So if you have a quick browse through that, and then individually, if you can give us a bit of feedback on whether you agree, if you think there's anything missing that you think is one of your key priorities when you're approaching your own projects or pieces of work. I'll keep it in order again with my OCD head. Anthony, do you want to go first?
I think there's one incredibly important one missing, which is affordability. And I think people also, like, there's obviously understandably a huge kind of foregrounding community, but in order for communities to survive and prosper and stay, I think the critical thing is how you make a space like long-term affordable. When we talk about gentrification and the kind of problems of that, and ultimately what we're saying there is the idea that sometimes these processes come in, increase the values, increase the rents, and the people who are there are forced on. And so without a real like underpinning of like how a place remains affordable in the long term, you will lose what makes places special. And you can see this as a thing that happens kind of throughout. I think there's a quote from Mark Fisher I always like, which is, there's nothing that increases sort of social conservatism than a mortgage. And I think that's this idea that like rents and mortgages and how expensive they are is a fundamental block to creativity. And I think all these things are incredibly important, but if you can't afford to be in a place, all of this disappears straight away.
Brilliant. And without it being a direct plug, it was exactly the premise behind Baltic Creative 15 years ago when it was set up, was around sort of protecting those spaces and keeping them flexible and affordable for creative and digital businesses, and having our long-term ownership model again. So all of the initial artists and creatives that were in this location that kick-started Baltic Creative weren't then ultimately priced out, because they are what make the space great and give it its cool and its edginess, and then ultimately have to go off to the next sort of crappy rundown area to start all over again because they're the space they can afford. Jo, anything different from your perspective?
Inclusive and diverse are up there. I think the other one that I'd had was authenticity. So making sure that we recognise every place as sort of unique and special characteristics, what makes them what they are. I think trying to avoid that copy and paste solution to regeneration and go and work somewhere else. So, you know, as a developer, we'll come in and it worked there, we made our money, we can just repeat that, put it on and impose that on an area and assume that somehow that's going to make a great place. It's not. It's not relating to the people, it's not responding to local needs, and it's not drawing on the unique, fantastic grassroots things that already exist. So making sure that when we're talking about place, we don't assume what's great, we speak to people, we explore what's there, and we're responsive to that, enable that to flourish, rather than just trying to be the next, I don't know, the next area in Manchester. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Great. And Phil, you touched on it briefly. You have a Meanwhile experience as well, and probably most of the audience will have heard of the depot Return to Freight Island over in Manchester. From a Meanwhile use perspective, does that change your approach into what you think makes it great?
Well, I think one of the words I was going to add to that was like the ability to do something organically. And the Meanwhile use, we work very hard to allow people within the communities. We find that, you know, the champions are the people doing interesting stuff, and we provide them with space and support and almost take a hands-off approach in a lot of ways, give them autonomy, and that allows things to grow organically, because when you've always got somebody over the top trying to, you know, say we want this or we want that, it kind of like neuters their creativity. And I think having the ability to think in a way like communities have always done, or places have always done in the past, where they have grown organically. There hasn't always been, you know, we're going to create a new destination here or create a new master plan here and this is what we want it to be. People have just done it. So I think the way that we approach it is we have an idea of what we want to do in the Meanwhile, and we find the people in the cities that are doing it and help, or they're doing something interesting that we feel could complement, and then provide them the space and the support to do what they're already doing, trying to always execute it into what you think it should be. You know, it really does kind of dampen it. So yeah, some autonomy I think is really interesting.
Thank you. And Kirsten, you've probably got almost two hats for this, in terms of obviously the three locations that you're based in have gone some way to creating their own places and communities, but you're also very much in the heart of a community that's evolving around you in the North Docks. So in terms of the kind of key elements on the screen, but also your experiences almost on the receiving end of that place evolution, be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think Make grew organically from a need that mine and my peers had, which was to have access to resource. So we have an innovation lab in our Heighton space that we've had for 2 years, and we've got a woodwork workshop in our North Dock space, and our Hamilton Square space in Birkenhead that we now own is on to have its own set of resources there. And I think acquiring that risk for our makers is a massive, massive part. Accessibility, so in a lot of the projects that we do, so our Made by Make, our commissions line, we will acquire those conversations with projects that might be out of reach for an individual, and we'll acquire the risk in terms of bankrolling that project, we'll insure it, we'll risk assess it, we'll hand pick all of the skills that exist in that portfolio of makers to deliver a really successful project. And I think with some of the projects that we've done over the last year, we did the Eurovision handover key for Malmö in Sweden, and we did Taylortown. We've worked with Ecotricity to do expedition at the exhibition centre recently in November. Those projects wouldn't be available to individuals, but they've cast them on a global scale. So we had 57 press releases for Liverpool Loves Taylor within a week. Some of our artists and makers were on USA Today and that sort of thing. And I think our organisation is opening those doors and also facilitating the equipment use and the opportunity there. So that's a fundamental thing that we do.
Okay, so just to come back to North Docks, obviously there's a feat of engineering that's popped up across the road from you. A magnificent stadium for a magnificent team, slightly biased. Just kind of leading into the consultation side of it and the actual process of engagement and bringing the community in to significant changes in regeneration or things that happen in any area. What's kind of happened for you as a business in that location? Have you been involved from the Bramley Moor development perspective? We're trying to make this whole day not Liverpool-centric because we did invite people from all over the north, but I think you've probably been living in a cave if you haven't heard about the new Everton Stadium and from a football perspective or regeneration perspective, it's a significant impact in that part of a rundown area historically that was always pitched for potential redevelopment, and the 10 Streets project. It was quite a slow burner, I think, in terms of what was happening, and it feels like Bramley Moor's a huge catalyst to a big change in that location. So from your perspective on the receiving end, how have you been engaged with in terms of that placemaking piece?
I think the fundamental thing is that we make ourselves very publicly indisposable, and it's essentially the engineering room of making is in North Liverpool. So you've got the Invisible Wind Factory, the team from the Casimir, you've got the Lantern Company there. There's a massive demographic of artists and makers in that space. And I think what we've done historically and continue to do, a massive part of our capacity is making sure that we are not pushed out of an area. And so from the onset of moving into an environment, we make sure that we are secure in that environment. We've been very successful in that in Birkenhead, which is our third space. We used to be in the Baltic Triangle. We strategically decided to leave the Baltic Triangle because we'd done everything we can here. But a part of what we do is, let me tell you a story actually, because it's quite nice. So when we moved to North Liverpool, my business partner and best friend, Liam, he was the chair of the Baltic Area CIC, so a well-developed area, sort of 10 years into its identity, and we were seeing the things that we've touched on, which is that developers see the artists, see the makers, see the musicians, see this great place with very little infrastructure, and they want a piece of it, and inevitably that forces up rents, and for artists who are often undermined in their value, it often pushes those people out. And so we have made a point of being around the table with councils and the influencers who exist. We think it's important that you are around a table rather than against the table, and we will get pitchforks out when we need to, but mostly we will be open to the conversation. And so we were doing a tour with Rural Council, who were about to deliver Borough of Culture. And they were interested in what we did in North Liverpool. And this was an area that has no streetlights, has no public transport, very antisocial behaviour, lots of warehouses, lots of businesses sort of under the radar. And they came around and they were like, this is incredible. There's, over 70 makers and artists there in this big woodwork workshop and these amazing projects and so many skills under one roof. And they said, we love it. We want a piece of this in the Wirral, but what a shame that people like this don't exist on the Wirral. And I went, hang on a minute. I was like, I'm from the Wirral. I studied art on the Wirral. I moved out of the Wirral because I couldn't realise my life here. And 30% of our tenants commute from the Wirral through the tunnel to Liverpool, to the dog end of North Liverpool, to this place that is unsuitable for the work that they do, because there is less risk in us doing this here than it is to do it in a place like the Wirral, which is a Grade 2 listed area, has all of the transport links, is aesthetically beautiful, has the best view in the world. And they went, okay, hands up, we overlooked that, and how do we help you deliver something that is sustainable and is permanent? And we now, as an arts organisation, have just bought a permanent home in Birkenhead. And, that's quite unique for an arts organisation to be able to do that. So a big part of what we make sure we do right at the beginning is make sure that we're indisposable, and that the narrative that follows is that we're part of that placemaking journey.
Yeah, on a long-term, permanent basis as well, which is really key, isn't it? So you just touched on the sort of public-private sector engagement and collaboration then. It'd be interesting to hear from the rest of the panel what your experiences and aspects in terms of engagement, and should there be more, is there not enough, or what the pros and cons are in terms of the placemaking, community regeneration landscape. And
there certainly needs to be more, and it needs to be not just lip service, for sure. It seems to be a move towards the understanding that it is essential, but there's still a bit of a lack of authenticity in it, and a lot of the engagement that I see happening and we've been part of just ends up in a report on someone's desk, and it doesn't really flow through into the actual master planning or the actual designs, which is frustrating for everyone, especially when you've worked really hard as a placemaker to go out and meet the people and build trust with people, and you're kind of you become the face of the development in a lot of ways. I think that is changing, and I think that there are lots of different ways that is now happening, digitally, so people can do it without actually attending the events. There's a lot of consultation fatigue, and a lot of these places that we've worked on, big master plans. It's changed, the developer has changed over time, so they then go back to the drawing board, and then they're going to have another kind of like vision for the space and another kind of aspiration for different kind of buildings, so they go back out and have more consultation with the communities, and it can lead to just almost like a state of disbelief in what you're trying to say. So, there are developers out there that are doing really good things, and they need to shout about it more. But they need to also demonstrate that they're listening to people, and it's not just the people that are shouting the loudest that are shout at every kind of objection, because that's often the way that it's seen. It's just we know better than the people that are on the ground, and we're just going to listen to them and do what we want anyway. They need to really understand that people have a valid opinion on their places, and they need to commit to that and have an authentic approach to it. So it is changing, but it is kind of frustrating. So it's wonderful to hear that they've taken that aboard, and you've actually been able to own something on a long term, because it is very short term a lot of the time.
And Joe, you're engaged by public sector organisations on occasion to go out and engage with private sector or with residents, communities. What's your kind of take on that, the success or the challenges of it?
I completely agree. It's definitely improved massively. I think when I set up Placed and I was I thought it made loads of sense to engage people. My background's housing, public sector, education. to me, it was obvious that you'd ask people what they want, and it was consistently, it's someone else's job, and we're not investing, and we don't want to know because they might want a roller coaster in the park, and we can't do it, so let's not ask. So it was quite that sort of very patronising perspective of people. It's definitely changed. I think it's changed because funding has required it to change. So a lot of the sort of major funding pots in recent years, especially since COVID, have made it a requirement, but they've made it a requirement at certain stages, and I think that's problematic. So it's a requirement at a master plan stage, but then when it gets to actual development, it's like, well, we did engagement 5 years ago, and people said this, so we can just crack on, and we don't need to continue a conversation. That's problematic. We can't assume because we've had a conversation with some people several years ago that we have then got permission to do whatever we want. And to me, I do agree that there can be fatigue from engagement, but I think that's because we're not being clear about why the conversation needs to continue. And so to me, I think we need a more ongoing conversation, but a more transparent and purposeful conversation. So people don't feel like there's engagement and then nothing happens for 5 years. They don't understand why nothing happened for 5 years. And that can be for lots of reasons, including funding, politics, planning, just how long a big project takes to deliver. So people feel like nothing's happened. And then by the time a conversation starts, again, like, well, what's the point in asking because you never listened last time? So I think it needs to be more joined up. We need to stop consulting on small projects and red line boundaries, and we need to continue the conversation in a much broader range of formats, and using the right format for the right time, but keeping those doors and those conversation pathways open throughout, I think, is really important.
Thank you. And Anthony, just to bring in probably your experience and work with Granby 4 Streets, that was a slightly different dynamic again in that you were working for and with a community-led, community-owned scheme. How does that change the engagement? Do you still actively engage with the surrounding community on a wider scale, or how did that play out?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of agree with what's being said, but I think one thing I'd add is there's probably like a critical difference between participation and collaboration, and most engagement is often very light participation, which is kind of one direction. You're inviting people to come and give their opinion, and then they're not really actively involved. And I think the strength and longevity of something like Granby is like there's an active collaboration with the people who are there, and they have a real stake in what's happening. And I think that's also the benefit of CLTs and community or collaborative ownership models, is through that there's a kind of long-term commitment and there's a real stake. And so it doesn't mean that you do exactly what everyone wants, but there's a kind of feeling of ownership and understanding and consistent dialogue over a long period of time, and that the people you're in dialogue with have a meaningful ability to shape the things that are happening. And I think that's, for us, is what's most rewarding and what we try and do in our projects as much as possible. And so in Granby, we were very fortunate to be working with an incredibly well-developed group of people, but in other projects, sometimes that doesn't exist. For example, I work up in Glasgow, but the work there is still about identifying those key people who can take a stake of the kind of creation of the organisation. In this case, in Glasgow, it was a venture playground that's now a kind of independent charity. And in doing so, take an active role in the shaping of it. So it's not just us as kind of external consultants being kind of, as you said, or like developers just kind of coming in and being like, yeah, okay, yeah, fine. Do you want it blue or red or green maybe? All right, we blue, great, that's done, tick, engaged. But actually they're really, from the kind of foundational point, shaping it. And I think that's, when it works best, that's the kind of engagement you want, and that's the kind of collaboration you want, rather than kind of a kind of, when it's done badly and cynically, it can be a very surface level thing. And I think the more we can encourage that kind of long-term, meaningful, I guess, shared ownership of projects, the kind of stronger they are, and the more robust then the communities around them are. Because like we talk about communities like it's just a thing that just happens, and it's not. Community, I always think community is actually quite an unhelpful word, because most areas are made up of multiple overlapping communities that in themselves have kind of complex dialogues and relationships. And community is like an emergent property that exists from kind of other features. And if you don't build those kind of foundations, you're not going to just come in and create a community. It's incredibly arrogant to think you're going to go in and make that. And so that would be my appeal, is like start slow, start listening, but use that to build a kind of ownership and a stake that is meaningfully embedded in the project. And I think all the things you're talking about, long-term ownership, and all these things are kind of vital in terms of creating that. And then you create something that's also robust and agile and resilient to change, rather than something that as soon as that external investment, external voice, external scrutiny disappears, kind of dissipates. And it's much more like, as a long-term.
Right. So you've all kind of touched on it slightly, but in terms of the sort of post-engagement process, when the consultations happened and all of that feedback's been taken on board, probably more private sector than public sector potentially, but it'd be interesting to understand where you think the accountability is. What's to stop a developer, for example, saying, great, we've done 1 million surveys, or we've sat in a room with all of the local community that wanted to turn up and engage with us, or whichever parties were approached to. They could then, at the next meeting, say, well, we need to value engineer that, or that was a great idea, but it's not going to happen. What do you think could improve in terms of that process, and what makes the driver of the place creator accountable, or how could that be more robust as a process? It's a slightly loaded question, but who wants to go?
I'll try. I guess it's maybe like focusing less on the visual output of what people are doing, i.e. it's less about what something looks like or how it, but it's more about like how it works and what it does, and people being meaningfully involved at that stage and using that to then shape what happens. Whereas like a lot of the time, as you said, we treat engagement like a kind of shopping list for things to do. It's like, oh, this is a great shopping list of things we can deliver. And it also becomes very transactional as a result then. The community demands, or community demands thing, and then the developer either provides it or doesn't. And I think you want it to be more reciprocal and more like, I think that, and again, when places that do it well, that long, because you then have people who are supporting the project in the long term as well. That would be, my main take.
Because I think the other aspect of it is if that party hasn't got a long-term interest in that location. So again, using us as an example, our community are our businesses here, and it's our own specific tenants, but it's also the wider community. But we constantly engage, then we do surveys, we have tenant socials, we have tenant more formal engagement, and our kind of job in life is to respond to all of that feedback. But we have literally got a shop window in the heart of our portfolio, so we're always going to be held accountable or taken to task if something hasn't happened that should happen. Or I suppose if you've got a developer that's going to do something and then disappear and go and do another project in a different city or a different part of the country, it's harder to keep them held to task and accountable for what they're delivering. What's the magic answer, Joe? It's the one.
I don't know. I think there is a broad lack of accountability generally at every stage, to be honest. I think without that long-term investment, it's a game of economics, isn't it? And so the developers have the power. You can say whatever you want. You can come in. If it's not viable anymore, the local authorities need that investment, and they need to see development, and they've promised that development. And so it becomes a really, really difficult power play within that dynamic. I can't say how you need to build that in, but I do believe that does need to be built in, that accountability. And I think that goes at every stage. So I guess where we're involved quite often is at the design, the master plan stage. And for example, whether it be social value or whether it be engagement, they're both regularly built into tenders for design projects, and it's a scored and it's a weighted question. But when it actually comes down to it, so often neither the engagement or the social value is delivered, because there's no one kind of going, what have you done? What difference did it make? Can you evidence you've done that? Can you evidence you've kind of showed that social value commitment? Can you evidence that you have engaged and changed your proposal as a result? No one's asking that question. And if we're not asking that at the easier stage, at the sort of conceptual, the planning, the strategic stage, when it comes to the developer, where there's a power and there's like direct economic benefit to them of getting in, selling quickly and getting out, then we're never really going to get there, I think. So I think we just need to rethink it right the way from the design phase to the delivery.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement with that. It's the perception of value that needs to change and the evidencing of that value. So it all kind of works on economic value. So why would we even think about putting sourdough bread in when we could put a pret in, and what are the benefits of doing that and how are we going to do that and what's their covenant? And I totally get that. And I'm learning that. I'm more of the creative. I'm more of the excited people going, there's a great bakery, there's a great organisation doing this, let's make this work. But we're constantly getting knocked back, so we're learning ourselves. It's just like we have to evidence value at every point. But there's little of it. And it is about that transformation, working with the industry to understand that there's social value, there's cultural value, and there is an economic argument for doing things that don't add up immediately, but over time they will. But you're right, the problem is that a lot of these projects are short-term. They'll be sold onto a pension fund in 5 years, and then they're out the door, and then that's okay. Stakeholders and shareholders are happy. Sorry, not stakeholders. And so it's not a very long-term view. There's no custodianship to it. It's very temporary in their long-term view of their business. So it is about the industry learning and working together, people like ourselves pulling together and somehow evidencing to the accountants in those businesses that this is a value and this is why you should do it and this is the argument for it, and it's worked here and it's worked here and it's worked here, and this is the ancillary value that has come up for the houses, the flats, the business leases surrounding, maybe just in the off the red line of your development, but in the area, and these are the reasons why you should do it. But I think that's going to take time.
Just I think I completely agree, and the one thing I'd say is in the UK compared to other places we've worked in Europe, it feels that government and local government takes a much lighter role in establishing the kind of master plan strategic decisions, and actually that's where some of these things can also be implemented. So we've worked a few times in France, and there the local authorities really dictate the terms of a tender of a plot of land. They're it has to be a school or nursery and 80% affordable housing, and as a result they get less from the developer for the value of the land, but in terms of the long-term value creation for that local authority, it's much higher. And I think here we're still stuck in a model where authorities are kind of forced to sell the assets for the highest initial cost, without, it feels that there's much less ability to be able to appraise the value over a longer period. If we had a school here, that would generate this, or if we had a workspace here. And as a result, you end up with that kind of relationship where you get a developer who has also then had to put the most amount of money in, and therefore has to make that return on that. And I think if we can, some councils seem better and more able to take on that kind of role, and that would be my I guess request, is to try and understand what value you can get, a kind of holistic appraisal of what value you want from a project, rather than just initial kind of return money in the bank from a developer, and in doing so potentially accept a smaller amount up front for a longer term kind of value creation from that project.
Great. So I think we've got about 5 minutes before we go to Q&A, if any of the audience want to start thinking about questions. So if we kind of wrap up a little bit with, if you can come up with an example of a project that you've worked on, any kind of scale or location of what you think was the best place that culminated from an engagement or a piece of work or something that you've directly worked on. Kirsten, it's probably asking what your favourite child is for you, but if any of your locations for Make CIC have been kind of, I suppose, had a wider impact, or just your favourite, if we start with you and give the rest of you an opportunity to think about yours.
In my favourite child, so I mean, I'm nostalgic about the one that's the most DIY, and actually North Docks is the one that is the most at risk, that is the building that is the least sustainable, and the one that has got this massive Everton development. And the irony of this moment is that actually we've divided our team, because right now there's disputes about parking permits in the area, and I won't talk too much about it, but there's a 15,000 person what's the word, petition around this parking permit and how it wipes out the 300 businesses in that area. And so my heart's with that one. It's the one that's the most disruptive, the one that's got the most leaks in the roof and all that sort of stuff. And I think we've obviously learned a lot from that one, which has created our sustainability. But remind me of your question so I don't go off on a tangent.
Just your favourite child. No, which of your projects, I suppose, has been the most impactful in terms of creating a place or any external impacts it might have had?
Yeah, I think the idea of our commissions, I'll try not to talk all the 5 minutes. The reason that we build commissions projects is because I came from graduated from an art school that had a wealth of equipment, woodworking, welding, darkroom facilities, you name it. My ambition is to have those facilities available for people to experiment. But what's came from that, the magic thing that's came from that, is that we now build these high-profile, amazing pieces of art in places that are outside of the gallery. And I think for a lot of people, if you can't see it, you don't feel like you can be it. And I think, Taylortown, I know I keep on going on about Taylortown, but it was so prolific. People were seeing art for the first time in an environment that was on their high streets in a moment where high streets feel as though people are out of touch with them. And I think people reclaiming their spaces means that actually it isn't about physicality in a building, it's about a community, it's about people. And we might not want to be next to Everton in 10 years. The important thing is that we're ready for that conversation and we're ready to move because we're a business that's made ourselves resilient in lots of ways. That means that we don't have to just move out in 28 days without a strategic plan.
Thank you. And Phil, if you can come up with your kind of most impactful project, and if whichever one it was, what its kind of USPs were, or what's made it amazing.
So my favourite project to date has been Mayfield in Manchester. So that's where Depot is. It's a 10,000 capacity culture venue. It's where Freight Island is, a big food venue, a street food hall. It's part of the development. The developers, you and I, who've just sold to Landsec, so slightly changed now, but incredibly purpose-driven, bold thinkers, disruptors in the industry, crazy ones really. And working with Broadwick Live, who are the guys behind Printworks, we put in some bold thinking, but these were thoughts that had already been tested. So Manchester International Festival had put on events in the depot, or in the Mayfield depot, with Massive Attack, so that it had been proved that it was safe to use, even though there was water pouring through the ceilings and it was like crap everywhere. But there was the ambition there to do something really bold and do something immediately, and to start it with culture, and to start it with the park, and to start it with purpose. And it happened really quickly. It was. I think we pitched on it for 2 months, and then Broadwick got the keys, and something like 12 weeks later, it was open with Ariana Grande at Manchester International Pride. And it just happened so quickly, but the intent was there. We worked with stakeholders in the city, we worked with warehouse projects, we worked with event production people in the city, like trusted people that the council had grown up with and were aware that they could do something very challenging but do it very securely. So we found, we worked with those stakeholders. We didn't come in thinking we're from London, we can do it ourselves. We found the right people. And the developers were completely 100% behind it. And what was great is they evidenced it as well. They worked with Realworth, who are over in the docks here in Liverpool, to evidence what they were doing. And I can't remember the numbers now, but it was a vast amount of money in the first 12 weeks when warehouse project opened. So from September through to January, the amount of revenue that had gone into the city through nighttime economy, through the taxi drivers, through the hotels, through the social purpose kind of initiatives, and the amount generated through ticket sales and corporate hires that then was put into a community fund was just vast. It was staggering, and they had that evidence, and therefore they were able to then take that to their funders and kind of extend the lease beyond the first couple of years. And then COVID hit, and the food market, Freight Island, was a real asset to the community because they had outdoor space and they had things to do. So there was it was just a perfect, not a perfect storm, but it was a perfect opposite storm of the right people coming together at the right time with the the balls from the developer and the council side to actually say, okay, we can do it. And
just obviously want to give Joe and Anthony a chance to answer that question, but just on Freight Island or the depot generally, it has been massively successful, and it was a meanwhile proposition for a long-term redevelopment. Has the success of it sort of changed the developer's view on whether it needs to be incorporated in the final solution or keep it a little bit longer, or is it not about that?
I believe it is. I'm not sure on the scale of it. When Richard Upton was still at UNI, it was definitely, we'll keep it at this scale and we'll just continue it all the way along. Now Landsec are involved, I'm not too sure. I doubt if they'll have a 10,000 capacity electronic music venue with, businesses upstairs. They might do. It's Printworks is now back into the master plan in its original form with some modifications. So they do, people are realising that kind of culture does add value. Yeah. But I'm not sure. It's certainly extended further than we thought it was going to be.
Yeah. It's made me walk to that part of town, which I never would have done historically.
Well, that was our brief, really. It was like, how do you get people to turn left instead of turn right into town?
Yeah, great. And Joe, have you got an answer for that one?
I've been debating if I go engagement or education. So I'm going to go education. I think as a baby, the Placed Academy is, I think, as an organisation, we feel really, really passionate about. So that's, we've done work with young people since day one, pre-day one. And the Academy's kind of evolved from that experience of working with young people on the basis that actually if those making decisions about our communities and about the future of place don't represent those communities, then they're not going to get it right with the best will in the world. So the Academy is our programme, which is now started as a programme for 14 to 18. It's now a programme for 11 to 25-year-olds. And it's very much a really supportive programme, which introduces young people to the range of careers in the built environment, increases the confidence, improves access to career pathways, gives them the skills, helps them put together portfolios or develop teamworking skills, but embedded in the programme is engagement. And so through working with the sector, they work on live projects, they develop their own solutions for the live projects and they present them to the clients and the design teams. And I think what's been brilliant is to see young people go through that programme and progress through the programme, go on to work in the sector, to be architects, to be planners, to be urban designers or policy makers. And a few of our alumni came up to me recently and were like, we're now the disruptors and we're out there asking for things to be different and challenging. Because the programme's given them the capacity and the skills and the confidence to challenge and say, this isn't good enough. What you're telling us is what we deserve, isn't what we deserve. And as a community and as young people, we're going to stand up for that. So I guess that's something that I feel, as a sector, we need to be working harder to make sure that the sector represents our communities. So probably that.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Anthony.
That's really hard. I've been debating the whole time it's been coming towards you about whether talk about which of the kind of few projects, either the kind of Baltic Street work up in Glasgow or the work here or Blackwell. I think I'm going to talk about the work in Granby. I think because it's one of the few projects we've been involved with that we've really been able to think kind of incrementally over a very long period, and I think that's been a huge part of its success in that I think it's really interesting when you're thinking about a model that often looks at like knocking everything down and starting again, and a kind of model that is kind of incremental and incredibly mixed. So it kind of started with the refurbishment of the houses in the area that were entirely derelict, but that was, the whole project was set in a kind of overall master plan that looked at a long-term vision of the neighbourhood as being a kind of complex interconnected, like different, a mixed-use neighbourhood. And I think that's something that a lot of developments really miss. And so there was an idea about commercial activity, idea about the high street, idea about a community space. And it's been, over the years, it's like looking at how those things have emerged. So the kind of houses came first, restored them, really changed working very closely with the CLT, changed the perception of the area, where there's a kind of huge amount more investment. Using the focus of the Turner Prize to kind of fundraise for Grammy Workshop and the Grammy Winter Garden. So Grammy Workshop is now an independent business, still in the area that produces architectural ceramics. It's now an employee-owned business that we kind of spun out of ourselves, and provides like long-term employment in an area that had nothing before. And it's small in scale, but it's a kind of catalyst. Grammy Winter Garden is a community centre that is extraordinary. It's this kind of captured ruin that sort of makes a reference back to how bleak it was at its worst, but turns out into something that's incredibly valuable, and it is this kind of heart of the community. And we've just broken ground on a kind of cafe and on work that, and it's not about, and I think what's interesting is since that work has started, many more organisations are investing in that area, and other people are refurbishing properties, and it's changed, hopefully, in a small way, changed the idea of these kind of boarded up areas of things that you can't do anything but demolish and start again, and actually something that thinks about the kind of material culture that is in those businesses. And I think that approach is something we're trying to increasingly look at development. You know, if you think about, especially, I think a particular interest, especially looking at kind of towns and the development that happened on the fringes of towns, that are these huge swathes of just chocolate box houses with nothing else, and thinking a way that these places can be like vibrant, functioning neighbourhoods is something that I think is our kind of almost like key interest now. Is like when you're looking at how you restore an area, thinking about how you can bring in creative workspace, thinking how you can bring in community spaces, thinking how you can bring in children, and avoid this thing of like monocultures that I think has been a real like risk of the way that we're currently developing. And I think that, that's the thing that we're sort of most excited about trying to do and bring forward.